We're still waiting for a few folks to join, but let's get started here since we're at 10:30. Welcome. My name is Jack McDougall, and I'm President and CEO of the Greater Washington Board of Trade. I want to thank you for taking time today for this important discussion on building resilience through corporate climate action. Even with the COVID-19 pandemic, its economic fallout, long overdue efforts to address racial equity, and a number of other things going on, climate remains a critical issue. In fact, current economic recovery efforts really do present us an opportunity to address climate action in ways that are both affordable and sustainable, which is really important. Infrastructure, supply chains, asset prices, economic growth, and so much more are all increasingly at risk. And a more connected global economy means these risks extend well beyond the point of impact. Today, we'll focus on some of the physical risks of climate change, the need to decarbonize, and the potential business opportunities in our region here and well beyond. I especially want to thank the folks at Skanska for sponsoring today's event. Skanska is an important member of the Board of Trade, and we greatly appreciate their support. Plus, I want to acknowledge and thank another key member, McKinsey Company, as our knowledge partner on climate and other critical efforts for our region. We're also very pleased to have a number of our members who are stepping forward to engage in climate action and help lead this region forward. And a few of these members are joining us today on our panel. We truly value their support and their commitment. We have Chris Rowe from Amazon, Melissa Lavinson from Pepco, Myrrh Caplan from Skanska, and Cynthia Curtis from JLL. You'll get a chance to meet them a little bit more in a few minutes. So thank you all for participating with us today. Really looking forward to a great discussion, learning more about all of your climate action plans and the unique ways that you're approaching these challenges. And now I'm going to hand things over to Kimberly Henderson, who will offer some current research on climate and lead our discussion today. Kimberly is a partner with McKinsey Company based here in Washington, D.C. She supports companies, investors in developing strategies for shifting to low carbon energy systems. She specializes in technologies to address climate change. So Kimberly, again, thank you and the entire McKinsey team for your support and partnership. As we go along, if anybody has any questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat room or the Q&As. We'll be taking a look at those. We'll get to as many as possible. And now with that, Kimberly, I'd like to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jack. So I'll share a brief presentation to help frame our discussion on climate change. And then we'll spend the bulk of the time with our wonderful panel, hearing about what each of their organizations are doing. Okay, so we've got two topics within this. So one is climate risk. So what does climate change actually mean in practice? And then the second is mitigation. What do we do about it? So where we are today here in 2020, we are really at a fork in the road on climate. And there are a number of paths that we could follow, and the decisions made now will determine which path we do follow. The 4 lines on this page depict 4 types of pathways we could be looking at. So one is continued growth in emissions. That's the red line. And that shows our CO2 emissions per year, just continuing business as usual to grow as they have. That leads to catastrophic climate change. The orange line is what we, McKinsey, think we're actually following as a society, based on what we're seeing on renewables and electric vehicles. As the economics for those technologies get better and better and adoption grows, we expect that we'll be on a lower emissions pathway, but still one with very high climate change. The lower climate pathways would be a 2-degree pathway or 1.5-degree pathway, which scientists are increasingly calling for to stabilize the climate. We are very far from those, and we would need to make some pretty drastic decisions in the near term to get onto those pathways. It is still possible, but the window is brief. So I'll talk first about what the higher emissions pathways will lead to. So what we see from climate change is that extreme events are becoming more frequent. And this is about risk probabilities. It's not about certainty. We don't know in any given year that we'll see extreme events, but the probability that it happens is getting higher and higher. And so this is actually looking historically from the 1960 to 1980 period compared to the 2011 to 2015 period. So this is not a forecast, this is historic data. And what this shows is summer temperature anomalies, so extreme heat in the summer in the Northern Hemisphere. And a temperature level that in the 60s and 70s would have had a 0.2% probability, now has a 15% probability. So again, that doesn't mean we'll see that high temperature in a given year, but the probability is much higher. And so these probability distributions are changing. And for many different climate metrics and in many parts of the world, I'll show a few examples of what that will mean as we look forward to the decades to come. So I'll give a couple international examples and then a little bit that's closer to home in DC. So this is Southern Europe. Many of you will have been there. And this is the drought frequency for Europe today. And drought does happen. And so you see a lot of it's kind of this light orange, maybe at 10 to 20% of the decade in drought. And this is an increase from historical data. So this is already more drought than what we've seen in the past in Europe. Now, I'd like you to look at Southern Europe, Spain, Italy, Southern France, Greece, and see what happens as we look forward to the 30 years from now, so 2050, and what scientists project for the percent of decade in drought. The projection is that by then, the majority of the decade you would see drought in Southern Europe. So essentially, if you can imagine the Sahara almost jumping up over the Mediterranean and having a very different climate in Southern Europe from what we've had in the past. That, of course, raises a lot of questions. What happens to agriculture in those countries? What happens to tourism? Do you have forest fires because of that drought? What happens to those economies? And are there any implications for Europe and the euro, et cetera? So clearly, we don't have all the answers, but it clearly, you would expect it to pose many challenges for that part of the world. Now, Europe is, of course, relatively privileged and better able to adapt than many parts of the world. I'll take a very different example with South Asia. And in South Asia, this is already a hot and humid part of the world, as many people will be aware. The level of heat, level of humidity that we see, though, it's not at the level that people can't survive there. A lot of people live there, and we were adapted for the climate of this planet. Now, there is a technical definition for what we would consider a lethal heat wave. And this is a combination of heat and humidity, a wet bulb temperature that exceeds 34 degrees Celsius. And it's the temperature at which a healthy human outside in the shade, hydrated, would likely suffer a lethal heat stroke after 5 hours of exposure. And we've never seen, to our knowledge, we've never seen an event like this. There is some risk in part of South Asia today, as you can see on the map. But again, it's relatively low and limited, and we don't think we've seen it. Now, if we look forward to the 2040s and 2050s, that risk increases significantly. And it covers a much bigger population. And so again, we can't say in any given year that this would happen, but the risk of an extreme event where you have heat waves that are lethal to human beings is really quite plausible as we look forward in this part of the world. And you might think that, well, if people have air conditioning, it'll be fine. But in India, about 90% of people do not have air conditioning. And over half of the labor force works outside. So the population is not currently at least prepared for this. Now let's look a little closer to home for DC. So in DC, a couple of the impacts that we can expect. So one is increased flooding. We already see flooding, but this would grow in the decades to come. And this is particularly critical for some of our critical infrastructure. So within the flood zones are Reagan Airport terminals, Union Station, some of our substations. So flooding could pose a risk to our critical infrastructure in DC at certain points. A second impact that we would expect to see is growing extreme heat. So similar to India, as many of you know, the DC area can be hot and humid. It will get more hot and humid. And we will see extreme heat days by 2050, an estimated, say, 10 to 15 days per year, which right now we don't see. So this is not something we've seen. If you think heat and humidity is already high in DC, this is on a different level. And we would expect that ultimately we do see more people, more fatalities due to extreme heat. Again, not as bad as India because the population's not as exposed, but it could still be in the thousands. So if we look across cases like this in different parts of the world of what's going to happen, we can summarize the impacts across 5 socioeconomic systems. So one is what we call livability and workability. So the extreme heat is a great example of that. And this gives the data that by 2030, so just 10 years from now, we would expect 300 million people, plus or minus, to live in areas with almost a 10% annual probability of such a heat wave. So that just affects humans' ability to survive and thrive in those climates. The second impact, which is often intuitive to people, is food systems. If we have drought, if we have flood, that puts our agriculture at risk, as we've already seen in parts of the US. The second and third here are linked, or the third and fourth are linked, physical assets and infrastructure. So that is our buildings at risk of flooding and damage from storms. Similar, our infrastructure. I mentioned for DC substations, our transport infrastructure. And then lastly is natural capital. And this is literally the biomes that we see on the earth that provide us with what we call ecosystem services. And what we see is by 2030, already about 30% of the world would be expected to shift biome. And this is pretty dramatic because this means that the natural environment around us would be changing. And that means it can support different functions. So for instance, coming back to the agriculture, if you have a different biome, it might support a different agricultural capabilities. So those impacts, however, are not the reason that scientists are saying 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, because it's very hard to say, okay, how much of those could we handle? The risk that scientists really want to avoid is what's called climate feedbacks and triggering certain changes in the Earth system that then would make global warming much worse. And so this page lists on the left a set of those changes that could be prompted by global warming, which would make global warming potentially much worse. So I'll give a couple examples just to bring this to life to people. So one would be along the lines of the biome shift. We could see dieback of the Amazon rainforest or the boreal rainforest. We're already seeing damage to those ecosystems, and there's already news around the risk of the Amazon shifting to a savanna type biome. Now, forests help to act as the lungs of the earth. They sequester a lot of CO2. If we lose those forests, not only does it emit the CO2, but then it's not there to help us sequester carbon in the future. And so we're effectively losing parts of the lungs of the earth. A different example would be permafrost melt. So permafrost melt is the ice in the northern hemisphere, largely Siberia. And within that, within the ice, within the land that's been frozen for human history, there is a lot of methane. And the risk is that an increasing amount of that methane will be released as that ice melts. And that methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, and it could be much larger than the greenhouse gas emissions we have put into the atmosphere ourselves. So each of these on the list here is a risk that it'll make climate change much worse. And we don't know exactly at what temperature increase that feedback is activated, but the bars, the yellow to red bars, give you a sense of where scientists think this is. And as you can see, already if we're at 2 degrees, we're starting to risk a number of these feedbacks. And so 1.5 degrees is considered the more prudent level to try to stabilize the climate before we trigger many of these feedbacks that then would make us unable to stabilize the climate. So that 1.5 degrees is the blue line that you see drawn on the left and the left side of the chart. And the gray is our current trajectory of what our McKinsey forecast would be, that we're headed for a 3.5 to 4.5 degree world. In which case you would trigger a lot of these feedbacks and actual climate change would be expected to be much higher. So it's hard to say how high. So what does it take to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees? Now, the sad reality is we've already incurred 1.1 degrees. So we've already spent a big part of our carbon budget, and there's not a lot of runway to 1.5 degrees. We've done a sector by sector analysis of what does it take for every sector of the economy to reduce emissions technically in line with this pathway. And if we bring it up at the global level, this is what the path would need to look like. So today we have about 40 gigatons of CO2 we emit per year. That would need to go to net zero by 2050. And we say net because there can still be some emissions if we're offsetting it with taking some CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now, by 2030, we would need to reduce our emissions by at least 50%. And the reason that that reduction is so steep is because what matters is the volume under the curve. It's the total volume of CO2 we emit. And we would need to remain within a carbon budget of 570 gigatons CO2 to stabilize the climate. Now, if you look across sectors, we find that we can do that. That is feasible. And it requires what we call 10 requirements here. And I've got them in 4 categories. So one is reducing our demand for energy efficiency, and for products that generate emissions through circular economy measures, optimization. Second is changing how we power and fuel our lives. So electrifying, decarbonizing power, using more hydrogen and biofuels for energy. The third is managing carbon, and this is carbon capture and storage at industrial sites, but also actually drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. And the low-tech way to do this is with trees by reforestation. There are high-tech ways to do this too. In parallel, we would need to stop deforestation. And then we would have to tackle other greenhouse gases, most notably methane, which comes primarily from cows and from the fossil fuel value chain. So if we do all of those things, we can stabilize the climate. That's the good news. And we don't have a lot of time, as I mentioned. So I'm conscious we're in a pandemic, we're in an economic crisis. A lot of people ask, can we do this now? And the fact is, if we don't, then the window closes. And so if we want to be on the 1.5 degree pathway and avoid the worst impacts of climate change, now is the time. We know what to do, it's feasible, but we need to bend the emission curve pretty quickly. So with that, I'd like to bring in our panel because we have some fantastic expertise on climate and sustainability, and a panel of folks who are really at the cold face of trying to solve this problem in a range of different industries. So I'll let them do their own brief intro to tell you a bit about themselves and what they're doing. And we'll go, why don't we go in order? Chris, Cynthia, Melissa, Myrrh, and you guys, I think you can come on camera now. Chris, do you want to kick us off?
Great, yeah, thanks, Kimberly. I'm Chris Rowe. I am part of Amazon's global sustainability organization, and I lead our renewable energy work and the sustainability efforts that we are undertaking in our buildings as part of Amazon's climate pledge to be net zero carbon by 2040, which we'll talk a bit more about here as the conversation evolves.
Great. Hi, I'm Cynthia Curtis. I'm with JLL, and I'm responsible for sustainability stakeholder engagement, and that means basically working with our key stakeholders, our clients, our suppliers, as well as our shareholders and member organizations to collaboratively bring action, meaningful action and change to address the worst impacts of climate change. Part of my responsibility is also delivering on our Scope 3 commitment under our science-based target, which we announced earlier this year.
Good morning. I'm Melissa Lavinson. I head up government and external affairs for Pepco Holdings. And that includes here in the District of Columbia with Pepco DC, as well as Pepco Maryland, and our utilities in Delmarva, Delaware, as well as Maryland, and Southern Jersey in Atlantic City Electric. And in my role, I lead our policy and stakeholder engagement efforts, including issues related to climate change, sustainability, and how to transition to the clean energy economy.
Myrrh?
Hi, and thank you for having us. Myrrh Caplan, Senior Sustainability Director for Skanska USA Building. I'm in my 16th year with Skanska. I lead our national team of project and client advisors around sustainability. I also lead a number of initiatives around carbon reduction, our community engagement program, as well as healthy buildings.
Fantastic. Thank you all. So for the audience, if you want to submit questions into the Q&A, please do so, and I'll monitor that as we go. But I'll kick us off with a few questions that I had lined up for our panelists. So to start, companies are increasingly expected to have a plan on climate change and to be taking action, almost regardless of the regulatory context. And many companies are coming out with very concrete goals and targets for lowering their emissions and reducing their climate risk. How are each of your companies approaching this and thinking about target setting?
Happy to jump in here. I alluded to the climate pledge in my intro, but Amazon co-founded the climate pledge in 2019 to be net zero carbon by 2040, 10 years ahead of the Paris Agreement. And really, we realized this is not a problem that we are able to solve alone. And so this commitment is not just an Amazon commitment, it is hopefully a call to action for companies across the world to join us and collaborate on this super important mission to reduce emissions. And so as part of our commitment to be net zero carbon, we have a number of sub-commitments and action plans to support that decarbonization effort within Amazon. A couple of which are, we are committed to powering our global operations with 100% renewable energy by 2025. We're well underway. We have over 90 renewable energy projects we've committed to already, and 12 of which are in the state of Commonwealth of Virginia, excuse me. And another, with regards to transportation, we have made one of the largest vehicle orders for electric vehicles in history, with 100,000 vehicles that we expect to be on the road over the next couple of years and throughout the next decade. So two components of our impacts are energy and transportation, and are making concrete plans and efforts to move emissions out of our system. We're also investing in new technology. So we launched the Climate Pledge Fund, a $2 billion venture capital fund to accelerate the work that new companies are doing and exploring on ways to decarbonize. So we're really excited to see where that goes. It's supporting not just our operations, but other companies and their abilities to accelerate work on decarbonization as well.
Thanks, Chris.
I'll follow on and the very impressive Amazon pledge and all the work you guys do, which is great. We also have committed, as I mentioned earlier this year, to a science-based target. And that requires us for our scope 1 and 2 to reduce our emissions by 2034 by about 68%. We'll be addressing that through energy efficiencies, that similar to what Chris was referencing, electrifying as well our fleet, and in our scope 3, which is 95% of our emissions, because we manage 1,500 times the square footage that we ourselves occupy. The bulk of our emissions are our scope 3. And so that requires us to work more collaboratively with our clients and with our suppliers to help them on their pathway and bring forward to them new approaches, new technologies, et cetera. Like Amazon, we have a JLL Spark as part of our JLL Technologies group. And through that organization, we invest in new technologies, obviously focused on the built sector technologies, and so bring those new approaches, new technologies to bear with our clients and into either the properties that our clients own or properties that they are occupying.
Melissa, go ahead.
Sure, thanks. I'll jump in. So just a couple things. Pepco being part of the larger Exelon family of companies, Exelon has actually reduced emissions so far 80% from a 2006 baseline, and continues to step up and do more. So across our companies, had a commitment to drive emissions even further, including the most recently we had a commitment to reduce emissions beyond that point to another 15% by 2022, which we're on track to do and are working on our next level of commitment as a holistic company. So really taking action to drive down emissions, not just within our region, but more broadly across the entire footprint of the company. And the way we really think about it, particularly here at Pepco and Pepco Holdings is, and I think my colleagues, Chris and Cynthia have mentioned this already, is we have the opportunity to drive emissions, not only for our own company footprint or scope 1 emissions, but as a utility company, we have the opportunity to help our customers reduce their emissions through the products and services that we offer, as well as help our communities do the same. And so we've had a couple initiatives to help do that, including similar to Amazon through our 2C2I initiative that's Exelon-wide, which is supporting entrepreneurs in the climate mitigation and adaptation space, trying to really advance innovation in that space, to creating a energy efficiency challenge here in the District of Columbia that ran this year called Reduce Energy Use DC, to supporting multiple nonprofits through our sustainable community grants program, where we're helping folks across our communities build resilience and advance sequestration activities. So we really look at this holistically, not only what we can do to reduce our own footprint, but also how we can help our customers and communities do the same.
Thanks, Melissa. Myrrh, anything to add?
Oh, yes. For Skanska, as both a construction and a development firm, we feel like there's a number of things that we can influence and improve on, and there's a very long list that I could go into. We had already been working on so many of those areas before climate became the focus. I think most organizations had in some capacity. And this was through our ISO 14001 program, our commitments since becoming one of the first member companies of the UN Global Compact and the Paris Accord and all of that. We also are an A- rated company within the Carbon Disclosure Project, the CDP, and that results in annual audits of our carbon reporting. And so in all, we were more than ready for this. We have set a carbon neutrality requirement for ourselves of 2045 for scopes 1, 2, and 3, with an interim goal of 50% reduction by 2030 for just scopes 1 and 2. We did make this a little more challenging for ourselves than we had to by choosing a baseline year of 2015. So yeah, since we had already been working on our carbon reductions for so many years preceding the 2015 baseline that we chose, we decided we wanted to start at the point where it seemed our supply chains and other industries were also committing. There was a certain maturity to the market, and that meant there was better data available. And it also meant that all of our markets globally saw increased collaboration between businesses and supply chain. And so it felt like the best starting point, so that it was the most accurate and the most impactful. So the exciting news is, even though we chose 2015, is that we've already hit our around 30% reduction against that 2015 baseline. And we've gotten this far by doing a number of things, like electrifying our mining equipment in the Nordics, developing highly efficient buildings, as you would suspect, focusing on materials with lower carbon impacts and reducing our business travel, which I think all of us here can agree, we have definitely reduced our business travel this year, but it was a broader decision thought around that. And much of that progress, and I think Chris alluded to this as well, it was not just through organizational will and labor, but also through major partnerships like ours with Volvo on that mining equipment initiative, and with the Carbon Leadership Forum, Microsoft, the U.S. Green Building Council and others on online tools that benefit society. And I'm sure we'll talk more about those as we move along here.
Thanks, Myrrh. So you all touched on the fact that this is not something that companies can do on their own, but rather it's about the whole system changing and changing the value chain, changing what our customers are doing, suppliers, investors, policymakers, maybe even competitors. I'd like to dive in a little more to some of that. And Cynthia and Myrrh, you both mentioned your Scope 3 emissions, which for the audience, that's the emissions that aren't directly from the company, but rather upstream or downstream in the value chain. And I just wanted to hear a bit more on how you're working with suppliers upstream or customers downstream to reduce those Scope 3, and conscious that buildings are really hard to decarbonize, and construction uses a lot of cement and steel, which are some of the hardest to abate industrial sectors, and combined they contribute about 15% of global emissions. And then buildings use a lot of our energy, so in the form of gas, in the form of power, which generates emissions. So you're kind of at the nexus of these sectors. How do you work with different players to get the whole system to change?
Yeah, that's a great question. And our purpose, JLL's purpose, which we released this year, is to shape the future of real estate for a better world. And that kind of thought, that approach has been flowing through really everything we do. Our sustainability report, the cover of our sustainability report this year was just a big, bold real estate, accounts for nearly 40% of total carbon emissions, and we're going to do something about it. So it was more of an in-your-face almost proclamation that JLL historically just hasn't done, but recognition, exactly to your point, Kimberly, that our industry is responsible for a good part of this challenge. And so we need to be accountable, and we need to take responsibility, and we need to be one of the leaders. We want to be one of the leaders in driving the meaningful impact change that just has to happen, right? So that has led us to the science-based target, that led us to a couple weeks ago announcing our net zero commitment with the World Green Building Council. So that's our Scopes 1 and 2 by 2030. So some really significant actions there, but clearly it's with our suppliers and it's with our clients where we're going to have the most significant impact. So earlier this year as well, we launched our our sustainable procurement framework. As you might expect, we buy an awful lot of stuff, not only for ourselves globally, but most significantly for our clients, on behalf of our clients. And so the framework has now been adopted by our sourcing and procurement teams globally. We're at different places, and different regions are further ahead than others. But the key point here is that they've all kind of come together, recognizing that they have a great role that they can play, and that this is something that's important more broadly for all of us. And we've gotten great feedback from our suppliers, who are really on board and excited, I would say, of the possibilities that this brings about. And the other piece with our clients, we've got most of our clients, I would say probably 80% of our clients have goals that they have publicly stated. Roughly 20% have a plan in place or funding assigned to those goals. And the rest are looking for help, and they're looking for partners to, how do we go about doing this? We'll have, on the one hand, the interfaces of the world, and there's not a lot of those, who worked with us to, rather than build a brand new headquarters building, actually, we worked with them and found a space that was smaller in footprint, but with the focus on embodied carbon, we're able to deliver, collaboratively, again, with them and other suppliers, a headquarters that met all of their requirements, but at a far smaller footprint, and with being able to account for that embodied carbon. So all of it, we don't do construction, but we do the management and the project management of that. So there's examples at that really robust level, all the way to we need to get our arms around how we can reduce our energy consumption. What can you do to help us there? So it really spans, and they're looking for help all across that spectrum.
Yeah, and I would lean in on Cynthia's comment about the interface headquarters, because if you've not been there, next time you are able to travel to Atlanta, I definitely recommend going. It's wonderful. So I'll pivot here and talk more about the supply chain, construction supply chain. So there's a number of ways that we are working with them, with different manufacturers to achieve reductions. But, as you said, steel and concrete continue to be the big pieces of the carbon puzzle here. It's because it's, emitting a lot in order to create those products, and they are the major components of a new construction and even some major renovations. So yes, specifically about concrete, it's, as most of you probably know on the call, it's basically gravel and cement and water. Cement is only up to about 10% of the mixture, but it has the CO2 effect of 80 to 90% of that concrete in total. And so by choosing slag products in concrete instead of cement, which has been common in the US for quite a while, we can lower the CO2 emissions by half, but that's still not enough. It's still an enormous number. And as the rest of the world is focusing, like Cynthia, focusing on operational carbon with clients, that embodied carbon becomes the bigger issue. It's the bigger piece of the pie. So we realized many years ago that we needed to do something about it. I think we're all here because we are doing things about things. It's action-based. We had been tracking our embodied carbon on our own developments for many, many years, but did not have a mechanism to identify the good, better, best in terms of products available. So we took the action of partnering with the University of Washington and the Carbon Leadership Forum to create the EC3 tool. Some of you may have heard of it. It's the Embodied Carbon in Construction Calculator. That's a mouthful. You can't say it 3 times fast. It takes a bank of environmental product declarations, which are very prevalent these days because of LEED version 4, which called out the necessity of those for credit backup. And, it then runs a comparative analysis. So when we do have a few EPDs, as they're shortened to, of any product to compare, we then overlay those results with cost and other criteria to help ourselves and our clients make better decisions. So my team of project advisors and members of our pre-construction teams in all the offices around the country have recently taken the next step of reaching out to, specifically around concrete, reaching out to the top 3 to 5 suppliers in each market and encouraging them to obtain EPDs for their mixes so that they can remain competitive and we can drive that message home that this is the new vernacular. So that is our answer to the concrete solution.
Thanks, Myrrh. Yeah, this is something we find in McKinsey, that procurement policies can make a big difference in terms of driving change. And I think I'll use that to pick on you, Chris, because I'm sure Amazon's probably facing some of that in its own procurement. And as we think about the capital region and development here, it's of course hard not to think of Amazon, with the big investments being made in Northern Virginia. So how does that investment kind of link to your climate commitments? And what are you doing kind of with partners or policymakers in the capital region on climate?
Great, thanks. Yeah, with HQ2, we've just surpassed our 1,000 employee of HQ2, but of course, we've been in the region for much longer and have over 18,000 Amazonians working. And we've invested in, I mentioned briefly, but 12 renewable energy projects to date in the Commonwealth. So we have invested in significant renewable energy in the region. I think one project in particular with regards to HQ2 that gets us really excited is a kind of first of its kind partnership. We realized coming in, wanting to be that good partner with Arlington County, looking at their sustainability goals, understanding kind of what are they up to, what are their challenges, and renewable energy was high on their list and as well. And so we realized we might be able to partner here on a project. And so we went to Dominion and worked with the local utility to figure out, is there a way that we can co-invest in a renewable energy project? And so we were super excited to announce a 120 megawatt solar project a couple hundred miles south of Arlington that will power not just HQ2, but much of Arlington County to help them meet their own sustainability commitments and goals. And outside of HQ2, it'll power our Whole Food stores, other fulfillment centers that we operate in the region. So kind of one tangible example of partnership that we hope really plant some seeds for future and continued growth and collaboration in the region.
Super. Thanks, Chris. Melissa, I might pick on you now, and you have a unique vantage point because I mean, if we look at the emissions in the District of Columbia, a lot of it is from things that could be electrified or from our power, which we need to decarbonize. And so Pepco kind of sits at the intersect of enabling a lot of this. And we're in a region where you're covering multiple jurisdictions. So, you know, we've got the District of Columbia, Maryland, Virginia, different city and county governments. And I know you wear the government policy hat, so you're probably deeply familiar with navigating this landscape. You know, what's the role in the public sector in helping to enable this? And how does it work kind of navigating across all those jurisdictions? Is there anything that could be streamlined?
Sure, and I think that's a great question. You're right. You know, as a electric distribution company, just, you know, first and foremost, just to orient and folks, right? We don't own any power plants, right? So we run the electric grid, we invest in the electric grid, and we build it out to enable a clean energy future and to enable climate solutions for our customers and our communities. And that's really the role that we play. And in that, policy plays a huge role. In a highly regulated industry in which we operate, you know, the role of the policymaker, the role of stakeholders in engaging in that process to make sure that we're all moving forward and aligned in a way that's going to help us decarbonize as quickly as possible and then move towards these cleaner energy technologies as quickly as possible is just fundamental. And so, you know, the good news is in our region, we have a lot of forward-leaning jurisdictions, whether it be in the District of Columbia, the state of Maryland, or in the counties in which we operate in Montgomery or Prince George's County. All are incredibly forward-leaning with regard to climate change, with establishing goals and objectives, whether it be around transportation electrification, energy efficiency, or renewable energy. And so if I could just look at the district in particular, you know, the district has very clear carbon reduction goals, including carbon neutral goals, has very clear renewable energy goals, including transitioning to 100% renewable energy by 2032, as well as very clear goals around energy efficiency and fleet electrification. So all these taken together, from Pepco's perspective, right, we see our role is helping to have our jurisdictions both meet their climate goals as well as our customers doing the same. So if I think about decarbonizing electricity, right, and the wedges that you showed, right, the first thing we need to do is decarbonize electricity. And in the district, 100%, we will be providing 100% renewable energy to customers in the district by 2032. Next thing we need to do, right, is be incredibly efficient around the energy use. And the district has very ambitious goals around building electrification as well as efficiency. And so from Pepco's perspective, right, we are in the process of developing programs and product offerings to help our customers meet those efficiency goals. And make that transition both for buildings as well as for homeowners and particularly low moderate income segment of the population, which we know energy efficiency can really help in terms of affordability and equity. We're also making investments in the grid so that we can enable the smooth interconnection of solar, both rooftop as well as community solar, And we have a program in the district that was approved by the commission to start the build out and help enable the build out of electric charging infrastructure for public charging. So whether it be taxi, rideshare, fleet, and also working very closely with our transit systems, both District Circulator as well as WMATA, on working on the electrification there and the electrification of our own fleet. So, these are just some of the ways that a company like ours, which again is that foundational, can really help with that. And having policy to establish really clear goals, timelines around those goals, and then all working together to figure out the best way to achieve them. I think that to me is kind of where I see the role of the public sector, and can really help us make that transition even more rapidly than we might even think.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how some of the goals around the world that governments have been setting just keep getting more aggressive. And I think we are meeting them. So it's not to the point where, people are failing to meet them. Yeah, I tend to agree, Melissa, that makes a huge difference. We had a question from the audience in Q&A, and this was directed to Chris, but I'll also open up to others if anybody has a view. And it's around hydrogen and renewable natural gas. And the question was the role of those in Amazon's strategy. I think maybe quickly, Chris, just for the audience who's less familiar, hydrogen is not used for energy at any notable scale today. But it is a low carbon solution for things that are hard to decarbonize. So it could be blended into the gas grid or gas-fired power turbines. It could be used to help produce steel potentially for long distance trucking. So things that are hard to decarbonize, hydrogen is an option, and it uses renewables to create hydrogen, which then we use for energy. In the US, I'd say the US is a little behind versus other markets in developing this technology, but maybe I'll be surprised with anything that the panelists have to say on this one. Chris?
Great. So yeah, we believe RNG and hydrogen both are going to have to play a role, but I think the really important piece of this is to understand what's the life cycle emissions of how the hydrogen was generated and the RNG itself. So I think, from a transportation perspective, from a last mile delivery, we really think there's a path for electrification directly, which is why we invested in electric delivery vans. I think for that middle mile transportation segment, especially like long haul trucking, I think we're doing a lot of experimentation and a lot of work right now to understand what's the right kind of fuel type and how do we do it in a way that truly does decarbonize our transportation infrastructure primarily. We do use hydrogen today. We have thousands of forklifts operating across the world that use hydrogen. So there are use cases where we think it's beneficial and it's already deployed, but I think RNG and hydrogen at scale, you pointed out, Kimberly, it's going to require more R&D and some thinking around the true life cycle carbon emissions to ensure that when we actually use hydrogen, it's not just coming from a fossil fuel that doesn't really get to our carbon goals in the end.
Yeah. Melissa, I don't know if you've come up against the hydrogen RNG topic, but I know for the gas system in many parts of the world, there's a discussion about, do you electrify or do you inject hydrogen or RNG, or is it some combination? Because frankly, they all have challenges. I don't know if you or Pepco have a perspective on this.
Yeah, so I will take off my Pepco hat for a minute on that, because we don't have a natural gas system here in the district, or operate a large one anywhere in our Pepco Holdings footprint. But kind of from a previous role, having worked for a company that did operate a very large natural gas system, you're right? It's the how can you replace liquid and gaseous fuels with hydrogen or renewable natural gas, and what are both the technology or technical issues or limitations around that? What are the supply challenges or issues around that, right? And then what is the cost impact? And I think those are kind of the three buckets that you really need to look at. Of one, how can you utilize the existing infrastructure and get as much alternative fuels in that pipeline infrastructure as possible, given the technical kind of limitations that currently exist. And I know those are getting better all the time. But then secondly is sort of the cost impact, right? Of at some point, and this gets back to policy, sort of, I think, have to make a determination about where you're going to invest dollars to build out the infrastructure, right, to decarbonize. Because at the end of the day, we need to always keep affordability front of mind, because if it's not affordable, it's not sustainable. And I think that's like a really important premise for all of us. And so I think we really do need to look at how do you leverage existing infrastructure, kind of what's the nexus between how much do you electrify versus how much do you clean up the existing liquid and gaseous fuel system, and then how do you move forward in that in a kind of optimal way from a customer perspective and an economic perspective.
Yeah, actually, if I could just key off of that, Melissa made a great point. It does, the economics have to make sense, and so how do you leverage that existing infrastructure in a way that can further that? We have been working with the Metro, WMATA there in DC for decades. Right, they've been a client of ours for a long time, and we were really excited that recently announced a solar deal, right? And actually, Melissa, I think referenced this. So it's up to, so they'll be putting solar on, I think it's 4 of the rail stations and parking spaces. The deal is worth $50 million over 25 years. And essentially what it does is it provides a way to use the infrastructure that exists that Metro has, and provide them with a recurring revenue stream, so that in times like a pandemic, when the ridership is down, and you are looking for sources of income, this is an example where it provides a revenue stream for the Metro, and it can power up to, or at least 1,500 homes, single family homes. So it's really a win-win-win. It gets, there's the solar, there's green energy that's coming onto the grid. It's providing, a revenue source, utilizing an existing infrastructure for the Metro, and it's providing the opportunity for more than 1,500 homes to be powered by solar. So it's just, it's that kind of, I think, innovative, creative thinking around engagement that we need, and that we're seeing a lot more of.
Okay. Thanks, Cynthia. I think and one question that came through in the chat that's related to this discussion, and Cynthia, maybe you'll have a perspective, from the real estate perspective, or Amazon, from your buildings, but on natural gas use in buildings, and Melissa and I discussed that you can electrify it, or you could try to decarbonize the gas. Like, how do you, as you think about building footprint and real estate, how do you think about that gas consumption and what can be done?
Yeah, that's a bigger than a bread box question, I have to say, because I'm in Boston, right? We've got hundreds of year-old building stock and the associated infrastructure underneath it, and modernizing that. Frankly, the leakage that exists in the infrastructure, the current infrastructure, is a huge issue. And people are like, well, we need more, we need more, we need more. Well, if you patch, you fix what is there, at least you can drive some efficiencies. But there's not a short answer here, but it does require the public sector engagement, because this is not something that any one of us here on our own, or even all 4 of us working together, would be able to solve. You've got to have public policy engagement when it comes to things like this. It's a requirement. So, I'm not trying to skirt the issue, but I'm just saying there's a big piece of the pie that isn't represented in this conversation that is critical to the conversation.
Yeah,
I think that's helpful. Go ahead, Melissa.
Sorry, I was just going to build on that, because I think Cynthia makes a great point that, and you touched on it earlier, right? And I know we've got several region policymakers on the phone, which is great, because I think that's just really critical, right? Setting the goals, basing it on input and facts from, all stakeholders understanding, right, and really getting a solid understanding of the existing infrastructure or infrastructure needs going forward to meet those goals is critical. And I think, right, then establishing that framework or pathway then allows, all of us to line up behind it and make the necessary investments and know that the investments we're making are the right ones to make. Because, all of us, we recoup our investments over longer periods of time, right? And we all have long time frames for getting things done, for making the plans, et cetera. So the sooner you know the goals and objectives, and those goals and objectives are based on, right, the best information we have today, then we can all really line up behind that and drive towards making that transformation that I think you're hearing. We all really, we all really want to make, and we're all doing our part to make today.
Super. So that actually probably alludes to what might be the answers to my last question, but I'll do a quick, if I could try to get like a 1-sentence answer from each of you on if you had a magic wand and could change one thing that then helps to reduce your sector's emissions by 50% by 2030, so in the next 10 years, what would be the one thing? What's the big unlock? Any ideas?
I will build off of what you shared, Kimberly, that and it's hard to keep it to 1 sentence here. That's a tough one. The largest barrier that I see for the next decade in terms of resilience and tying it to climate is to increase the circularity of the material supply chain. I think that we have, sorry, I'm going into my second sentence here. We have ignored that for so long that now it is definitely working against us and will continue to do so.
Okay, circularity, great point. Chris?
I'm going to go with electrification. I think that's a huge component. It's just so fundamental to so many other unlocks that I think if we can electrify overnight in a way that's equitable and thoughtful, that'd be a huge unlock.
Would keep Pepco busy too. Melissa, Cynthia, anything to add?
I would say building standards and codes, improving building standards and codes. I mean, one of the things, in our space, Skanska as well, when you're talking about Class A buildings, you get investment there, and you can get to a better decision, a more efficient decision, the investments made, et cetera. When you start talking about Class B, Class C, you're not going to make those investments are much harder to come by, and the decisions to make those investments are not going to come typically without impetus, without building codes, without standards that elevate the requirement.
Okay, building codes and standards. Melissa, I know you pushed on the policy point. Do you have a similar angle?
I think I've talked about the policy point, but I think I'll get really granular on a technology point. I think if magic wand, if we could increase the capacity while reducing the size of battery storage would be a big unlock. So.
Right, so we need solid state, fingers crossed. Smaller, yeah. Jack, do you want to close us out? Thank you to the panel.
Sure, great. Thanks, everybody. Kimberly, thank you for presenting some really interesting new analysis that I know you all have been working with and that we've been working with as well. And I want to just thank all the panelists, Chris, Myrrh, and Melissa and Cynthia. We look forward to engaging with you all on this as we move forward. One of the silver linings of the pandemic is it does offer us an opportunity to reimagine the economy and what the economic renewal needs to look like. And so we really need to take that opportunity now and move forward with it. Remain cautiously optimistic that we can do this. And I think one of the points that was made, I think throughout this conversation too, is that it has to be affordable. So, we have to be able to do this. And so I think the more pragmatic we can be in our planning and how we're setting targets and how we're going after them, even if they are aggressive, the better off that we're going to be. And one thing I will just to close on is I know Chuck Bean had joined us for a while with the Council of Governments, and they're going through the process right now at looking at regional reduction targets over the near and medium term. And so we'll be working closely with them too to figure out how we can move the region forward on this. But again, I just thank you all so much. And I want to thank everybody who joined us today. This is a great conversation and there's a lot more to come. So stay well and have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.